My manipulative stepdad claimed I was overreacting about his emergencies in my bathroom, then had the nerve to complain that my feminine products were making his hemorrhoids worse when he used my bathroom. I replaced my hemorrhoid cream with a tube of superglue mixed with gold glitter and waited exactly 1 day. The ER doctor couldn't stop laughing when my stepdad arrived with his butt cheeks permanently glued together, sparkling like a disco ball. The nurse actually took a photo for their break room wall of shame before security escorted him out for creating a spectacle. My mother called me 4 times that night, hysteria mounting with each voicemail. By the 4th call, she was sobbing about divorce lawyers and asking where exactly I'd purchased industrial-grade adhesive. I was standing in my childhood bedroom doorway watching paramedics wheel out my screaming stepdad on a stretcher when his bathrobe fell open, revealing his glittering posterior to the entire neighborhood. Mrs. Chen from next door dropped her groceries. The Martinez kids stopped their basketball game mid-shot. Even the mailman paused his route to gawk at the spectacle unfolding on our front lawn. My stepdad's face had gone from its usual ruddy complexion to a shade of purple I'd only seen on eggplants at the farmer's market. His hands clawed at the gurney rails while he shrieked about lawsuits and assault charges. But the gold sparkles catching the afternoon sunlight made him look less threatening and more like a rejected craft project. I'm Cassandra Brooks, the daughter my mother barely acknowledged after marrying Gerald Patterson 3 years ago. Before Gerald invaded our lives, Mom and I had been a team since Dad died when I was 12. We'd built a comfortable existence in our modest 3-bedroom house in suburban Phoenix, surviving on Mom's teaching salary and Dad's life insurance payout. Then Gerald appeared at her school district's annual fundraiser, a recently divorced insurance adjuster with a beer gut, a superiority complex, and an unsettling habit of standing too close when he talked. Mom fell for his manufactured charm like a teenager with her first crush, ignoring every red flag I desperately waved in front of her face. Within 6 months, he'd moved into our house, claimed the master bathroom as his personal throne room, and begun his systematic campaign to make my life unbearable. But what Gerald didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything, building a case against him that would explode in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. And that tube of superglue in my bathroom was just the opening act. Gerald's bathroom invasion started innocently enough, or at least that's how he framed them to my mother. The first time he barged into my private bathroom claiming an emergency, I was in the shower. I heard the door slam open, heard his heavy breathing through the curtain, heard him settle onto my toilet with a grunt that suggested he'd be there a while. When I screamed at him to get out, he'd called me hysterical. When I complained to Mom, she'd sighed and said I needed to be more understanding about his digestive issues. The second invasion happened while I was doing my makeup before a job interview. He didn't knock, didn't apologize, just shoved past me and locked himself in my bathroom for 40 minutes while I pounded on the door, reminding him that the house had 2 other perfectly functional bathrooms. His response through the door was that mine had better water pressure and the master bathroom toilet was too low for his bad knees. By invasion number 7, I'd started keeping a detailed log with timestamps, descriptions, and my mother's dismissive responses. Gerald would use my bathroom at least 3 times weekly, always when I was home, always leaving behind evidence of his presence that ranged from unpleasant to deliberately disgusting. He'd leave the toilet seat up despite knowing I lived alone in that space. He'd use my decorative hand towels to dry his hands, leaving them damp and gross. Once, I found beard trimmings in my sink, even though my bathroom didn't have his shaving supplies. When I confronted him about that particular violation, he'd smirked and said he'd wanted to try my better lighting. My mother's response was that I was being territorial about a room in her house, conveniently forgetting that this house had been Dad's and mine long before Gerald materialized with his baggage and boundary issues. The hemorrhoid cream complaint came on a Tuesday evening during what Gerald called a family dinner, which really meant him holding court while Mom and I served him. He was halfway through his 3rd beer when he announced loudly that my bathroom had become unusable due to all my female products cluttering the space. He specifically mentioned that he'd had to move my tampons and pads just to find the hemorrhoid cream he'd apparently been storing in my medicine cabinet without permission. My mother actually apologized to him. She apologized to this man for my having basic hygiene products in my own bathroom. I excused myself from the table before I said something that would get me kicked out of the house I'd grown up in. That night, lying in bed listening to Gerald snoring through the thin walls, I started planning. not just planning to set boundaries or have another useless conversation with my spineless mother. Planning something that would make Gerald regret ever stepping foot in my bathroom, my house, my life. The superglue idea came from my best friend Rita, who worked as a veterinary technician and had stories about animals getting into adhesives that would make your hair curl. She mentioned it as a cautionary tale during our weekly coffee date, explaining how they'd once treated a dog who'd gotten into construction adhesive and required sedation just to separate his paws. The glitter was my own creative addition, inspired by a revenge story I'd read online about someone pranking their office nemesis. I spent 2 days researching adhesive types, reading medical forums about accidental exposure, and calculating exactly how much discomfort I could cause without creating permanent damage. My pharmacy job gave me access to empty medication tubes that looked identical to the hemorrhoid cream Gerald had been stealing from my cabinet. The superglue came from a hardware store 3 towns over where nobody knew me. The gold glitter was cosmetic grade from a craft store, fine enough to embed but inert enough not to cause chemical burns. I made the switch on a Sunday afternoon while Gerald and Mom were at his brother's barbecue. The real hemorrhoid cream went into my purse for later disposal. The fake tube, filled with fast-acting adhesive mixed with just enough glitter to be unmistakable, went into the exact spot where Gerald had been helping himself to my supplies. I made sure everything else in the bathroom looked untouched, normal, inviting. Then I waited. Monday passed without incident. Tuesday morning, I heard Gerald's heavy footsteps on the stairs at 6 a.m., heard my bathroom door close, heard the lock click. I stayed in my bedroom, heart pounding, counting the minutes. At minute 7, I heard the first yelp. By minute 10, his yelling had reached a pitch I'd never heard from a grown man. My mother was banging on the bathroom door, demanding to know what was wrong, while Gerald shrieked something incomprehensible about his ass being on fire. I emerged from my bedroom, phone already in hand, recording every second of audio for the documentation file I'd been building for months. The paramedics arrived within 15 minutes of Mom's frantic call. By then, Gerald had somehow managed to unlock the bathroom door while simultaneously trying to pry his butt cheeks apart with his hands, which only spread the adhesive to his fingers. The gold glitter had started catching the bathroom's vanity lights, creating this disco ball effect across his lower half that would have been hilarious if it wasn't so disgusting. The younger paramedic took one look at the situation and had to step into the hallway to compose himself. His partner, a woman in her 50s with the exhausted expression of someone who'd seen everything, asked Gerald very calmly what he'd applied to the affected area. Gerald, still not understanding what had happened, kept insisting it was just regular hemorrhoid cream from my medicine cabinet. That's when the paramedic picked up the empty tube from my bathroom counter, read the label I'd carefully preserved, and asked me very pointedly if I had any idea how the original contents had been replaced with industrial adhesive. I looked her dead in the eye and said I had absolutely no idea, but I'd been complaining for months about Gerald using my private bathroom without permission. My mother gasped like I'd confessed to murder. Gerald's eyes went wide with the dawning realization that this wasn't an accident. The ER became Gerald's personal nightmare, and I made sure to document every humiliating second from the waiting room, where hospital policy forced us to stay. The triage nurse's face when Gerald described his predicament was absolutely priceless, shifting from professional concern to barely suppressed laughter in under 5 seconds. She asked him to rate his pain on a scale of 1 to 10. Gerald, sweating through his shirt and unable to sit properly on the plastic chair, screamed that it was an 11 and demanded immediate attention. The nurse very calmly explained that glued buttocks, while uncomfortable, were not a life-threatening emergency, and he'd need to wait his turn behind the actual trauma cases. My mother spent the entire waiting period alternating between glaring at me accusingly and trying to comfort Gerald, who kept shifting his weight from foot to foot like a toddler who needed to pee. Other patients were staring. A teenager in the corner was definitely filming on his phone until his mother smacked his hand down. After 3 hours, they finally called Gerald back to an examination room. My mother tried to follow, but the nurse informed her that only the patient was allowed in treatment areas unless he was a minor or incapacitated. Gerald's face went through several emotions as he realized he'd have to explain his glittery adhesive situation to strangers without my mother there to defend him. I watched him waddle through the double doors, his bathrobe still barely covering his sparkling posterior, and felt absolutely zero remorse. My phone buzzed with a text from Rita asking for updates. I sent her a photo I'd sneakily taken of Gerald in the waiting room with the caption, "Craft project gone wrong." Her response was 5 laughing emojis followed by, "You're my hero." An older woman sitting across from me leaned over and whispered that whatever I'd done to that man, he probably deserved it. When I asked how she knew I'd done anything, she winked and said she raised 4 daughters and recognized justified revenge when she saw it. The doctor who eventually treated Gerald was younger than I expected, probably fresh out of residency with the kind of enthusiasm that hadn't been crushed by years of dealing with humanity's stupidity. He emerged from the examination room 40 minutes later with tears in his eyes from laughing and asked to speak with me privately. My mother tried to insert herself into the conversation, but the doctor very firmly told her this was a matter concerning the patient's treatment and potential legal implications. We stepped into a small consultation room where he closed the door and immediately asked me if I was the one who'd switched the hemorrhoid cream. I didn't confirm or deny, just asked if Gerald was going to be okay. The doctor said Gerald would survive, though removing the adhesive required a very uncomfortable procedure involving medical-grade solvents and more glitter contamination than he'd ever seen in his professional career. He also mentioned that Gerald had threatened to press charges against me for assault, but the hospital's legal team had already advised him that would be difficult to prove, since he'd been using my private bathroom and my personal medical supplies without permission. The doctor leaned in closer and said, off the record, that Gerald had spent the entire examination complaining about me, my mother, and every woman he'd ever encountered, which made the nursing staff's sympathy level drop to absolute zero. What happened next exceeded every fantasy I'd harbored during those months of documenting Gerald's invasions. The hospital's social worker appeared wanting to discuss what she delicately termed a concerning pattern of boundary violations in our household. Someone, probably that observant older paramedic, had flagged Gerald's admission with notes about him repeatedly accessing my private bathroom despite my objections. The social worker asked me point blank if I felt safe in my home. My mother, who'd finally been allowed into the consultation room, interrupted to insist everything was fine, and I was just being dramatic about normal family dynamics. I pulled out my phone and showed the social worker my documentation file. 3 months of detailed logs with dates, times, and descriptions of each invasion. Screenshots of text messages where I'd begged my mother to make Gerald stop. Photos I'd taken of Gerald's deliberate messes in my bathroom. Even recordings of him mocking my complaints during those awful family dinners. The social worker's expression shifted from polite concern to genuine alarm. She excused herself to make some calls, leaving me alone with my mother, who looked at me like I'd betrayed her rather than defended myself. My mother's voice was ice when she finally spoke. She asked how I could do this to her, to Gerald, to our family. She accused me of ruining her marriage, her happiness, her chance at companionship after years of being alone. Every word was designed to make me feel guilty, to make me back down like I had countless times before. But I was done backing down. I told her very calmly that Gerald had spent 3 years systematically violating my privacy and autonomy, while she enabled his behavior because she was too desperate for male attention to see what was happening to her daughter. I told her that Dad would be ashamed of how she'd let a stranger invade the home he'd worked so hard to provide for us. I told her that I was 24 years old paying rent to live in my childhood bedroom, while some middle-aged man with boundary issues treated my private spaces like his personal territory. My mother slapped me, actually raised her hand and slapped me across the face in that hospital consultation room. The sound echoed off the sterile walls. My cheek stung, and something inside me that had been barely holding together finally broke clean through. The social worker returned at that exact moment to witness my mother's hand still raised, my face red, and my expression completely done with everything. She asked my mother to step outside, which my mother refused to do until hospital security was called to escort her to the waiting room. Once we were alone again, the social worker laid out options I hadn't even considered: temporary housing assistance, legal resources for filing restraining orders, contact information for a local women's shelter that helped with boundary violation cases. She was treating this like the serious situation it was, instead of just some family squabble over bathroom access. She also mentioned that Gerald's behavior pattern and my documentation suggested potential escalation, that men who repeatedly violated physical boundaries often progressed to worse behaviors. She'd seen it before. She asked if Gerald had ever touched me inappropriately, come into my room uninvited, made sexual comments. The answer to all three was yes, though I'd minimized those incidents in my own mind because they seemed less concrete than the bathroom invasions. Writing them down in that consultation room, seeing them listed in official documentation, made them real in a way they hadn't been when I was just surviving them. Gerald's return from the treatment area was announced by his screaming before we even saw him. The adhesive removal had required 3 medical professionals, 2 different solvent solutions, and what the nurse delicately termed significant manual intervention. He emerged from the double doors walking like he'd spent a week on horseback, his face purple with rage, his eyes immediately finding me in the waiting room. He pointed at me with one of his bandaged fingers where the superglue had transferred and yelled that I was going to jail for assault. The entire ER waiting room went silent. A security guard stepped forward, and I did something I'd never done in my entire life when confronting Gerald. I smiled. Not a nervous smile or a placating smile, but a genuine expression of satisfaction that made his rage falter for just a second. I pulled out my phone, opened the voice recording app I'd had running since we arrived at the hospital, and played back his entire rant to the doctor about how I needed to learn my place, how women in his house followed his rules, how my mother should have raised me better. The security guard's expression changed from annoyed to alert. He asked Gerald very carefully to repeat what he'd just said about rules in his house. Gerald, too angry to recognize the trap, launched into another tirade about how he was the man of the house, and I was just a tenant who needed to show respect for his authority. I interrupted to clarify very loudly that I'd been living in that house since I was born, that my father had bought it 20 years ago, and that Gerald had moved in only 3 years ago after marrying my mother. A woman behind me actually said, "Oh shit," loud enough for everyone to hear. The security guard asked to see my ID, asked for my mother's name, and then asked Gerald if he'd actually been using my private bathroom against my expressed wishes. Gerald tried to spin it as just family sharing spaces, but the security guard cut him off to explain that unauthorized entry into someone's private bathroom constituted trespassing regardless of family relationships. He also mentioned that the hospital's legal team was reviewing the case, and Gerald might want to consult his own attorney before making any more accusations about assault. My mother finally reappeared from wherever security had deposited her, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. She approached Gerald and tried to take his arm, but he shook her off violently enough that the security guard stepped between them. Gerald announced to everyone in that waiting room that he was leaving, that we could all go to hell and that he'd see me in court. He stormed toward the exit, still walking like a cowboy who'd lost a fight with his horse. The automatic doors opened, and Gerald realized he'd arrived in an ambulance, didn't have his car, and his insurance wasn't going to cover a ride share for his glitter-contaminated posterior. He stood there in the doorway for a long moment before turning back to demand that my mother drive him home. She looked at me, looked at him, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw something like clarity in her eyes. She told Gerald she needed to speak with me first. His face went from purple to nearly black. He called her a very specific name that made the security guard's hand move toward his radio, and then Gerald made his biggest mistake of the night by rushing toward my mother with his hand raised. The security guard tackled Gerald before he could reach us. 2 other guards materialized from nowhere to help restrain him while he screamed about his rights and discrimination and lawsuits. The ER doctor reappeared looking significantly less amused than before and informed Gerald that the hospital was filing a report about his threatening behavior and he was being banned from the premises. A police officer who'd been dealing with another patient came over to assess the situation. I provided my phone with all the recordings, my documentation file, and a very calm explanation of 3 years of escalating boundary violations. The officer listened, took notes, and asked if I wanted to press charges for the intimidation and Gerald's admission about entering my bathroom without permission. I said yes. My mother gasped like I'd stabbed her, and Gerald finally stopped struggling against the security guards as he realized just how thoroughly his night had spiraled from a prank to a criminal case. The police officer asked me and my mother to provide formal statements at the station. Gerald was being held for processing on charges of intimidation and trespassing. The hospital social worker appeared again to give me paperwork about filing for an emergency protective order. My mother kept trying to speak to me, but I walked past her without acknowledgement and followed the officer to his patrol car. Rita called during the drive to the station, asking if I needed her to come. I told her to meet me at the police station with an overnight bag, because I wasn't going back to that house tonight. When the officer overheard that comment, He asked if I had somewhere safe to stay. I assured him Rita's apartment was available. He nodded and mentioned that based on what he'd reviewed in my documentation, the protective order would likely be approved by morning. The thought of Gerald being legally barred from coming near me felt like breathing clean air for the first time in 3 years. I'd planned for humiliation. I'd executed a perfect prank. But I'd somehow stumbled into actual legal consequences that would change everything. My mother arrived at the police station 30 minutes after me looking like she'd aged a decade in one night. She tried to approach me in the waiting area, but I held up my hand to stop her. I told her very clearly that she had chosen Gerald over her daughter repeatedly for 3 years, that she'd enabled his invasion of my privacy and person, that she'd slapped me in a hospital, and that I was done making excuses for her desperate need for male validation. She started crying, which once upon a time would have made me comfort her. Instead, I turned to the officer, taking my statement, and asked if I needed to speak with my mother or if I could complete my report independently. He offered me a private room. I accepted, and I left my mother sitting in that waiting room crying alone, exactly as she'd left me to deal with Gerald's torment alone for 3 long years. The last thing I saw before the door closed was her face crumpling with the realization that she'd lost her daughter to protect a man who wasn't worth protecting. The protective order hearing happened 3 days later in a courthouse that smelled like old coffee and desperation. Gerald showed up with a lawyer he clearly couldn't afford, a nervous-looking public defender who kept shuffling papers like they might contain some magical defense for his client's behavior. I showed up with my documentation file printed and organized in a 3-ring binder, my phone full of recordings, and Rita sitting beside me for moral support. The judge was a woman in her 60s who listened to Gerald's lawyer argue that this was just a family misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Then she read through my documentation. All of it. Every single logged incident with dates and times. Every text message I'd sent begging my mother to intervene. Every photo of Gerald's deliberate messes in my bathroom. When she finished reading, she looked at Gerald with the kind of expression that could freeze lava and asked him directly if he'd repeatedly entered my private bathroom against my expressed wishes. Gerald tried to explain about his digestive issues and bathroom preferences. The judge cut him off and asked a yes or no question. He finally muttered yes. The judge granted my protective order immediately. Gerald was barred from coming within 500 feet of me, from entering the house where I lived, from contacting me directly or through third parties. His face went white as she explained that violating this order would result in immediate arrest. His lawyer tried to argue about the house being jointly occupied by Gerald's wife, but I provided documentation that my name was on the property deed as co-owner with my mother from when my father died. Gerald had no legal claim to that house beyond being married to my mother. The judge noted this fact and asked if my mother was present. My mother, who'd been sitting in the back of the courtroom looking like a ghost, stood up slowly. The judge asked her directly if she understood that allowing Gerald to violate this protective order would make her an accessory to a crime. My mother nodded without speaking. The judge then asked if she planned to continue her marriage to a man who was now legally barred from her home. My mother looked at Gerald, looked at me, and something in her face finally broke the way it should have broken 3 years ago. She told the judge she needed time to think. That weekend, my mother filed for divorce. Not because she suddenly realized Gerald was terrible, but because having a husband who couldn't legally enter her house was inconvenient for her. She called me 17 times trying to explain her decision like I should congratulate her for doing the bare minimum. I didn't answer any of the calls. Rita's apartment had become my sanctuary, a place where I could exist without checking over my shoulder or locking my bathroom door. I'd taken a leave of absence from my pharmacy job, partly to deal with the legal situation and partly because word had spread about what I'd done to Gerald. Some coworkers thought I was a hero. Others thought I was vindictive and cruel. My supervisor had suggested the leave to let things cool down, which was corporate speak for them wanting the drama away from customers. I spent my days apartment hunting, researching what it would take to get my name fully on that house deed, and ignoring my mother's increasingly desperate attempts to rebuild a relationship she'd destroyed. Gerald's revenge attempts started exactly 1 week after the protective order. He created fake social media accounts to harass me until I reported each one and got them shut down. He sent letters to my workplace claiming I was dangerous and unstable until my supervisor called to verify the protective order and banned him from the premises. He tried to turn our mutual acquaintances against me by spreading a story about how I'd assaulted him unprovoked, but most people had heard through the grapevine about his bathroom violations and sided with me. His biggest tactical error was trying to contest my co-ownership of the house, claiming my mother's marital property should include my inheritance from my father. His lawyer filed the motion. My lawyer, provided through a legal aid program for domestic boundary violation cases, destroyed the argument with documentation of the original property transfer and my father's will. The judge not only dismissed Gerald's claim, but ordered him to pay my legal fees for wasting the court's time. The most satisfying moment came 6 weeks after the superglue incident when I received a call from Gerald's employer. Apparently, someone had sent them copies of all the recordings where Gerald discussed his views on women, his descriptions of invading my privacy, and his various threats. That someone was definitely me, though I'd used an anonymous email account and a library computer to avoid direct attribution. Gerald's insurance company took a very dim view of their adjusters harboring those kinds of attitudes, particularly in an industry that required entering people's homes. They'd launched an internal investigation. 3 days later, Gerald was terminated for violation of their ethics policy. He tried to claim unemployment. His company contested it with evidence of his misconduct. He lost. Rita sent me a bottle of wine to celebrate, and we spent an evening toasting to karma being a beautiful thing with glitter on top. My mother's attempts at reconciliation intensified after Gerald lost his job. She'd call crying about how hard things were, how Gerald was angry all the time, how she didn't know how they'd afford the divorce. I finally answered one call just to tell her that none of this was my problem. She'd chosen Gerald over me repeatedly. She'd slapped me in a hospital. She'd enabled 3 years of psychological torment and privacy violations. Her marriage falling apart was the natural consequence of her terrible judgment, and I wasn't going to light myself on fire to keep her warm anymore. She tried to argue that family forgives, that I should understand her loneliness after my father died, that Gerald had seemed different when they first met. I told her that plenty of people are lonely without letting predators into their homes. I told her that her loneliness didn't justify sacrificing her daughter's safety and sanity. I told her that she was welcome to visit me once she'd finalized her divorce and completed some therapy to address why she'd chosen a man like Gerald in the first place. Then I hung up and blocked her number. 3 months later, I moved back into my childhood home. My childhood home. Not my mother's house with Gerald's presence contaminating every corner, but mine. The divorce was finalized. Gerald was living with his brother in another state, reportedly working a series of temp jobs, and still complaining about his glittery assault case to anyone who'd listen. My mother had moved into a small apartment across town, the house being awarded to me in the divorce settlement since Gerald had no legal claim, and my mother couldn't afford to buy out my share of the inheritance. She'd tried one last time to convince me to let her stay, but I'd been firm. The house was mine. She could visit when I decided she'd earned that privilege. She'd cried and called me cruel. I'd reminded her that cruelty was standing by while your husband tormented your daughter. We hadn't spoken in 6 weeks. I spent 2 weeks deep cleaning every surface Gerald had touched, replacing bathroom fixtures he'd contaminated, repainting walls to erase any reminder of his presence. Rita helped me burn his remaining possessions in the backyard fire pit, including the bathrobe he'd been wearing the day the paramedics took him away. We roasted marshmallows over the flames and laughed about gold glitter becoming my signature revenge tactic. My bathroom, my beautiful private bathroom that Gerald had violated so many times, got completely renovated. New tiles, new fixtures, a lock that would require a battering ram to break. I installed a small plaque inside that read, "Private property. Trespassers will be glittered," that made me smile every time I saw it. Gerald attempted contact exactly once after the protective order expired. He sent a letter to my workplace demanding I drop all charges and reimburse him for his medical bills. My lawyer responded with a letter detailing every legal consequence Gerald had already faced and promising more if he continued harassment. We never heard from him again. Last I heard through mutual acquaintances, he was living in Ohio working at a call center and telling people he'd left Arizona to pursue better opportunities. Nobody who knew the truth bothered correcting him. His humiliation had been thorough enough that he'd fled the state rather than face the people who'd witnessed his glittery downfall. My mother sent a card on my 25th birthday with a long letter about regrets and understanding and hoping we could rebuild. I read it once and filed it away with all the other documentation from that period. Maybe someday I'd forgive her. Maybe someday I'd let her back into my life in some limited capacity. But not today. Not this year. Possibly not ever. She'd chosen a man who invaded my privacy, disrespected my boundaries, and made me feel unsafe in my own home. She'd enabled his behavior until I was forced to defend myself with superglue and glitter because nothing else had worked. The consequences of her choices were hers to live with. Rita and I still laugh about that night in the ER whenever we need a mood lift. She's moved in with me now, splitting rent and making the house feel alive again in a way it hasn't since my father died. We've turned Gerald's former invasion routes into a joke between us, leaving fake tubes of glittered superglue in random places as decorative reminders. My bathroom remains gloriously private, used only by people I actually invite into my space. I sleep without listening for unwanted footsteps. I exist without someone constantly testing my boundaries to see how much violation I'll tolerate. The glitter never completely came out of the ER floors, according to the nurse who'd helped treat Gerald. She told me months later when I ran into her at the pharmacy that they still find sparkles in that examination room, that it's become a legendary story among hospital staff. The man whose butt cheeks got glued together with craft store glitter because he couldn't respect his stepdaughter's bathroom. They've used it as a teaching moment about boundary violations and karma. I'd achieved something I never intended by making Gerald's humiliation permanent in a way that reaches beyond just my personal revenge. I wake up in my house, the one my father worked so hard to provide, that Gerald tried to claim through marriage, that my mother nearly sacrificed for companionship. I walk into my bathroom with its new fixtures and privacy plaque. I go to work without checking over my shoulder. And I know with absolute certainty that some people learn respect through boundaries and consequences, while others learn it through industrial adhesive and emergency room visits that become workplace legends. Gerald got exactly what he deserved, and I got my home back without a single regret about the method. That's what real justice looks like when it sparkles.